So, good afternoon, all. In today's session, we will discuss about the management of agrobiodiversity for a sustainable future. How the agrobiodiversity plays a major role in sustainable agriculture and how we can conserve and manage it. We will learn about that thing in detail. So let's start with the topic. And first one is that why agrobiodiversity is important. So in your previous sessions, you might have learned the role of agrobiodiversity. And once again, I'm just refreshing it that the agrobiodiversity plays a major role in evolution and crop improvement through breeding purpose. If we talk about that, there are many varieties of various crop plants, and how these have been evolved. It has been through cross breeding between the various varieties. So the evolution and crop improvement, whether we want to introduce disease resistant genes or drought tolerant genes into the newer varieties of our crop plants, then the conservation of agrobiodiversity is very, very important. Second is the biological support to the production. If we talk about the agriculture production system, we refer that as the agro ecosystem. In that, various kinds of abiotic and biotic components play a major role in the production of the crops or production of the output of the crop plants. So in that, basically, if we talk about the soil biota and also the insects, the diversity of insects, they play a major role in production of the agriculture crops. So in that, we have the beneficial insects such as your bumblebees and honeybees. Along with that, we have the butterflies, and in your soil biota, we have the earthworms. So these biological support system, they play a major role in the production of the crops. Then we have the wider ecological roles or functions, in which the primary production and also your nutrient cycling in the agro ecosystems, they all depend upon the agrobiodiversity. So agrobiodiversity plays a major role in cycling of various nutrients like carbon, nitrogen, and your phosphorus. So these are the major roles which are played by the agrobiodiversity in the agro ecosystems. Then we have the plant genetic resources. If we talk about, there are 7,000 species of the plants which are cultivated uh, at present for various human use. And the diversity which we see in these crop plants, they have evolved with the interaction with the human beings from several thousand years. So that's why we can see the various varieties which have evolved now. And if we talk about the current scenario, the biodiversity is, and the agro ecosystem we talk about, they are getting homogenized. At 30 crops are there which fulfill 95% of the human food needs, and four major of them are your rice, wheat, maize, and potato. So you can talk about that we are increasingly focusing on the monocultures and also on one variety of the crop plant, and that's why we are seeing the erosion of the agrobiodiversity. Then the plant genetic resources, if we talk about, they are the basis of the food security. More the diversity, more is the is human beings food security. If the genetic resources, they get eroded, obviously that leads to the threat to the food security, as disease they can threaten our crop plants, and that can result in mass devastation at large scale. So diversity of seeds and planting material of traditional varieties, modern cultivars, crop wild relatives, and other wild plant species, they basically they encompass the plant genetic resources. So next is the crop and crop associated biodiversity. And crop associated biodiversity is a sum of non-crop living organisms found in agro ecosystem. In the beginning of the session, I talk about that there are various kinds of insects and other biota, which include your even your microorganisms such as bacteria and fungi. They also are associated within the agro ecosystems. We all know about the rhizobium bacteria. Then we have the Anabena, which is the fungi. They play a major role in fixing the nitrogen. So basically, blue-green algae, they are also basically involved in the agro ecosystem. So these are commonly termed under the umbrella term, which is known as a crop-associated biodiversity, which is the sum of all the non-crop living organisms. They also include the pests and diseases which harm our uh, crops. So the pests are also included under the crop associated biodiversity. And the plant biodiversity basically include the crops and the livestock purposefully. These are included in the plant biodiversity, in which the human beings, they plan them and they introduce them into the agro ecosystem. For example, you have crops, which varieties they have to be introduced into the agro ecosystem. They are decided by the human beings, and that's why they form the part and parcel of the plant biodiversity. Okay. And then we have the unplanned biodiversity, which include your soil flora and fauna, which includes your earthworms, and also various kinds of pollinators, wild pollinators. If we talk about, not introduced one, I'm talking about here the wild pollinators like bees, bumblebees, and also your honeybees and butterflies. They are all part sort of this. Then we have the carnivores. If you can see in insects, we have uh, basically the red ladybird beetle, which is an excellent predator for your aphids. Then we have the various kind of decomposers, which include mainly your fungi and other species of various organisms, which are part and parcel of the agro ecosystem. And this also, mind you, include your weeds also. Then we come to the key concerns of the agriculture sector. At present, there are many issues which are threatening the agricultural sector. First one is the increased usage of the agricultural chemicals and fertilizers. To increase the agricultural output, there is increased use of chemicals and fertilizers, which are uh, and pesticides, which are basically chemical based. And when we use them, obviously that threaten our entire agro ecosystem, that threaten our the flora and fauna which is associated with agri ecosystem. And then it also causes pollution, and it also harms the human health. Then we have the fragmentation of the agricultural lands. Basically, the land holdings, they are getting smaller and smaller because of the increased population pressure. The division of agricultural land, it leads to fragmentation of agricultural land, and that basically threatens the agri ecosystem. Then we have the soil degradation. In that, basically the use of fertilizers, pesticides, and unsustainable farming practices, that basically they are leading to the soil degradation, soil salinization, and increased soil pollution and soil erosion. So that is also a key concern which is threatening the agriculture sector. Then we have the excessive tillage and inappropriate crop rotation. If we talk about in India, for example, in Punjab and Haryana, we have only two crops or rotation cycle which is being followed. First is the wheat, which is grown in the Rabi season, and then we have the rice, which is grown in the Kharif season. So this should not be the pattern which should be followed, but unfortunately, this is being followed in these agrarian states at very large scale. So and then excessive tillage basically threaten the soil biota. The repeated tillage of the soil, it hampers the soil biota, and also it also leads to soil erosion and soil degradation. Then we have the loss of agrobiodiversity, which causes the overall threat to the agro ecosystem. And then we have the climate change. And mind you, agriculture sector at present in India, we talk about 13% of the GHGs, mainly they are released because of the farm sector into the atmosphere, and which leads to your global warming and climate change. So agriculture sector is also contributing towards the climate change, and it also the climate change basically has the negative externalities or negative effect on the your agriculture ecosystem or agro ecosystem. The droughts are getting very common, the floods are getting very common these days, and it is all because of the global warming and the climate change. Then we come to how to manage the agricultural biodiversity. These are the various ways which I enlisted here. We will learn them in detail in the future slides. The first one is a good agricultural practices. Your agriculture practices must be sustainable, must be environment friendly. Then we can address the problem of the various problems which are associated with the agro ecosystems and environmental problems which are associated with them, and also conserve the agro biodiversity. Then we have the species based conservation. We have learned that also in the management of the biodiversity. During that session, we have discussed that also in detail. Here also we will talk about once again. Then we have the area based conservation. Basically it talks about the hotspots and the ecoregions. So here also we will apply the same concept. Then we have the ecosystem approaches, how the entire agro ecosystems they can be conserved. And then we have the creating a supportive environment, followed by improving the practice of conservation on the ground. So how we can ensure that on grounds conservation can be ensured, or the grassroots level conservation of agro biodiversity can be ensured. We will learn all of them in detail in future slides. Let's talk about the good agricultural practices. So here we have basically the ways through which good agricultural practices they can be implemented, and the agriculture can be made sustainable. So here we have the first point, which is maintaining a high level of crop genetic diversity, both on the farm level and also on the seed banks. So basically, if the crop genetic diversity is more sustainable will be our agro ecosystems, and definitely that leads to stabilization of the production and also the nutritional diversity. Then we have the integrating through ecosystems approach strategies, the plant biodiversity. Uh, Basically, ecosystem service approach, basically we integrate the agro biodiversity through the plant biodiversity way into our agro ecosystems. Next is the inclusion of perennial crops in the agriculture field. This is very important. Mind you, many kind of pollinators, they are associated with our agro ecosystems. And all the time our crops, they are not in flowering or fruiting stage. So for maintaining the population of wild pollinators, we need some kind of perennial crop cover. In that, we need some crops which... Hello, please mute your mic. Okay, thank you. So basically in that we need some perennial crop cover which can flower during the off-season stage, so that they can sustain the various kinds of pollinating species and predators of the pest species when your main crop is not in flowering or fruiting stage. Okay, and then so basically the perennials, they play a major role in that. And then we have to adopt the production system management strategies, and in this we have to adopt such strategies which are not disturbing to the soil, and maintain mulch covers from crop residues, and cover crops which increase the biological activities. So basically this point which talks about that we have to maintain the mulch cover, the soil must have a large amount of organic matter into that. And we have to basically in Punjab and Haryana, if you look over that during October, November, the parali is increasingly being burned, and the farmers they are not finding the viable solution for that. So basically, this crop residues they can provide an increase excellent mulch cover, and which can increase the carbon and the nitrogen content within the soil, and also it will help in increasing the agrobiodiversity. Then the soil structure must be maintained. Soil like in excessive tilling practices must be avoided in that, and cover crops should be grown along with your main crops to ensure the sustainable agriculture uh, with, within your area. So next is species based conservation. So in this we talk about how the various species which are linked with the agrobiodiversity they can be conserved. We have seen in the biodiversity where we have taken various kind of step for conservation of tigers, rhinos, your elephants. Similarly, the same thing can work here also, where we can target various kind of species which are associated with the agro ecosystems, and then we can chalk out species based conservation plans for conservation of these species. So here, this approach basically works through various ways. Either we can basically select some of the threatened species which are linked with the agro ecosystem, and then we can check out some plan for conservation of these species. Then we have the keystone species. Keystone species play a major role in carrying out various ecosystem processes. If the keystone species they are removed, the entire ecosystem can collapse. So we can focus on the conservation of these keystone species, and by conservation of them, the entire ecosystem can be conserved. Then we have conservation of the wild species, which are important for the purpose of food, fiber, then building material, or other kinds of biological attributes which are associated with them. So wild species or the wild relatives of the crop plants, they can also be selected for the species based conservation. We can target them, and we can save them or conserve them for their future uses, for present uses also and for the future uses also. Then we have the conservation of species which have some non-use value. So if we talk about some species, they have maybe they look very beautiful, or they have some aesthetic value, or some other kind of significance which is attached to them. So we can also focus in our species based conservation program on them also. So these are various strategies which can be involved in the species based conservation program of the agrobiodiversity. Then we have the area based conservation approach. In the area based conservation approach, we basically select the area in which the agrobiodiversity is basically present, and we conserve the entire area on the basis of the same. So basically, if we talk about the normal biodiversity, in that we have seen the approach of the national parks and the wildlife sanctuaries. They are all part and parcel of the area based conservation. Uh, then in that the same works here also, and in that we have talked about the biodiversity hotspot. Similar concept can be applied here also. We have the agricultural hotspot, the areas with large number of species which are known as endemics, and which can be provided with the conservation. Then we have the eco-region approach, which we have learned also in the biodiversity management of the biodiversity and conservation of the biodiversity. The same concept also is applicable in this scenario. Then we have the ecosystem approaches. There are various kinds of ecosystem approaches which can be followed for the conservation of the agrobiodiversity, which basically focuses on the conservation of the entire ecosystem, the processes of the ecosystems, and the various kinds of functions which are related to the ecosystem. So this kind of ecosystem approach basically should be decentralized to the lowest appropriate level. This must be ensured. And then ecosystem managers should consider the effects of their activities on the adjacent and other ecosystems. This is very important, that we generally focus on the one kind of ecosystem, but in nature many kinds of ecosystems, they are interlinked with each other. The similar thing is applicable in the case of your agro ecosystems also. There is exchange of materials and energy between the various kinds of ecosystem, and that's why this should be also considered in the ecosystem based approach of conservation. So also the ecosystem approach of conservation must contextualize or take into consideration the economic aspects or the potential gains which we get from the conservation of the ecosystems. This must be also followed, especially in the case of agrobiodiversity. We just not go on conserving, we just also have to look at the economic concept or economic side of that approach, that it should be economically viable, and it also has some potential gains. We have to also look towards that aspect. Then we have the conservation of the ecosystem structure and function. As I told you, the ecosystem structure and functions must be conserved in the ecosystem approach based conservation tactics. And then we have the ecosystem approach should be undertaken at the appropriate spatial and temporal scale. This is also very, very important, that the spatial and temporal scale, the time, and also the space, it's also very important. If we talk about the ecosystem based approach, the relevant time must be there, and also we have to think in the short term scenario and also in the long term scenario. That what can be the effect in the short term scenario and what can be the effect in the long term scenario. We have to basically precipitate them, that what can be thing and what point should be followed in the short term strategies, and what strategies should in the long term approach or long term scenario. This must also be recognized in your action plan in the ecosystem approach based conservation. Then the conservationist must have to recognize the fact that the changes, they are inevitable, that ecosystems and the are viable to various kinds of changes at the spatial scale and also the temporal scale. So accordingly, the conservationists, they have to accommodate this scenario also in this in its conservation strategy. So the ecosystem approach, they also seek to balance between the integration of conservation and use of biological diversity, and also it should integrate the indigenous and the local knowledge. The local knowledge and the indigenous practices which are followed in a particular area, they must also be integrated in the conservation approach. Especially in case of agri-biodiversity, this can be seen that the local people, they have far more knowledge of the indigenous varieties of various kind of crop plants. So that traditional knowledge and how they are basically conserving them or managing them, that should also be integrated in the ecosystem approach based conservation module. Then we talk about this is basically the agrobiodiversity conservation index, and basically in this we have the three pillars which are associated with it. First one is the healthy diet. The conservation of the biodiversity must ensure that the plants or the agrobiodiversity which is conserved should provide the healthy diets. Then it should The second point is the sustainable agriculture. The sustainable agriculture point of view must be integrated in the conservation plan of the biodiversity. And next is how the current and future use options they are manifested. In that scale also, the agro biodiversity must be conserved. So these are basically the three pillars of the agro biodiversity conservation index, and these points must be taken into the commitment and also the actions and also the status. So how the biodiversity must be conserved, these must be evaluated in the terms of these three pillars, and also these should be manifested in the commitment and action and status. Then we come to creating a supportive environment. Uh, how we can create a supportive environment for conservation of the agrobiodiversity. The first one is engaging with the biodiversity related conventions. There are very many conventions such as CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity. There are many kinds of other conventions which are related with it. So basically all the stakeholders and also the governments must be, if they want to conserve the agrobiodiversity, they must engage with the biodiversity related convention, and they must formulate such policies which are abiding with these conventions. Next, we have achieving the internal coherence. So there are many kinds of agencies, multiple agencies which are working on the ground, and there must be internal coherence between all these agencies. They must be aiming towards a common cause, and there should be internal coordination between these agencies. So that is part and parcel of creating a supporting environment. Then we have the moving away from the centrality of the projects. As I told you that ecosystems, they are always basically in the changing scenario. They are always changing. They are always very dynamic in nature. So here also there are many kinds of perceived and unperceived threats which are threatening to the ecosystem. The conservationists must be integrating all these challenges which they basically face off from time to time in the conservation strategies or the management of conservation. So that must also be integrated with the conservation framework. Next is improving the practice of conservation on the ground. So basically, this talks about that grassroots level conservation strategies. We have all talked about till now the policy matters, and also how our laws should be there, which should be protecting the agro biodiversity. Now this point talks about how to bring these policies and implement them on the ground level. So basically, first thing we have to state is to clarify our objectives. Our objectives must be very much clear, that what kind of things we need to follow for the conservation of the agrobiodiversity. Then is second is setting our targets. Our goals or targets should be very much clear, that what we have to achieve. Third one is to identify the impediments, various kinds of problems or the roadblocks they are there, which needs to be addressed. Some are perceived at a very early stage, and some are unfortunately not be visible, but as we chalk out our conservation plan, we might encounter them in future. So we have to basically identify all the impediments which are there, and then we have to basically have adaptive management plan which should be in place, followed by stakeholder involvement. This is very important. Stakeholder involvement, basically we have to include the local and the indigenous people in our management plan. We have to, because they are the main stakeholders of the agro biodiversity conservation, and also they derive various kinds of benefits from them. So we have to basically involve them. Their traditional model of agriculture, agro biodiversity management must be learned. that also be integrated into our management plan. So stakeholder involvement is very much important. Then finally is reporting and documentation. At this point, we have to basically report the stages, and also report on ground variations which we get in while we implement our conservation plan. So reporting and documentation is also very much important, whether our plan is giving us some positive result, or it is showing the negative result, how we can correct it. That all depends upon the reporting and the documentation aspect. So this diagram shows how the conservation of the plant genetic resources, seed production and supply, and plant breeding, they are interrelated with each other, and how they play a major role in management of the agro ecosystem. This diagram clearly indicates that. For example, we can see, and first we can talk about the conservation of plant genetic resources. If we conserve the plant genetic resources through restoration process, that gives us the constant supply of seed production, various kinds of newer seeds. And similarly, the uh, conservation of plant genetic resources gives us or provides us the genetic diversity which can be used for the plant breeding purpose. When the plant breeding purpose, the new cultivars they are generated, which are again used in the production of the seeds. And in this seed production and supply, the germ plants which is restored can be used for conservation of plant genetic resources for the future purpose. Then in the plant breeding also, the elite germplasm information which is generated during the plant breeding process, that can be used for the conservation of the plant genetic resources. So all in all, these three things, they are interlinked with each other, and they are also interlinked with the farmers and agro ecosystem. How they are interlinked? For example, here if I talk about the conservation of the plant genetic resources, the farmers, they all have also various kinds of cultivars of the crops, which and when they conserve them, that can contribute towards the conservation of the plant genetic resources. And the XC2 conservation, if we provide to the conservation of the genetic resources, if we talk about, we will learn about the XC2 and the in-situ processes in the future slides. But here you can concentrate that XC2 conservation, if we talk about, then if the plant resources, they are conserved in the gene banks or the seed banks that can be used by the farmers for the future use. Similarly, mm, uh, the farmers, they or the seed growers, they can contribute towards the seed production and the supply, and they can also save the seeds for the future use, which can be again used for the continuance of the agro ecosystem. And then the seed production and supply also contributes to the farmers for providing the good quality seeds which can be used for the agro ecosystem. If we talk about the plant breeding, here the various kinds of trials, they are conducted in the fields, and for the field trial, basically the farmers, they are basically employed for that. Along with that, the participatory plant breeding, in which the farmer communities, they are involved in the participatory plant breeding, that how plant breeding must be carried out in the future, that also involve your farmers. So all in all, these three processes which you can see in the slide, they are interlinked with each other. Now we come to the in situ and ex situ conservation strategies of the agrobiodiversity. As we have learned in the biodiversity, the wild biodiversity, that there are in situ and ex situ methods of conservation of the biodiversity. Similarly, we have, in the case of agrobiodiversity, in situ and ex situ methods of biodiversity, agrobiodiversity conservation. And as it is clear from the definition that in situ concept basically talks about the on-site conservation of the agrobiodiversity, and ex situ conservation methods basically focus on the off-site conservation of the agrobiodiversity. So in situ conservation aspect basically involves a conservation of trees, crops, wild relatives of the crop plants, conservation of the land races, underutilized species on the farmer's field. And basically we talk about in many developing countries, the small farmers or the small landholders, they play a major role in situ conservation, because they are the ones who are dealing with the traditional varieties of the crop plants, and they are conserving them for the future use. They are also basically utilizing them. They are using them for their own personal use, and also conserving them for the future generation, or for the future use. So they play a very important role in situ conservation of the agrobiodiversity. Then home gardens also, if we see that many kinds of home gardens are there, in which various kinds of your fruit plants, condiments, spices, along with your main crops, they are cultivated. So they are also the repositories of the large number of species. So if we talk about the resource poor farmers, they are organic by default only, because they are having very less money. So they are basically using the farmyard manure, and also the organic pesticides for controlling the pest. So they are basically organic by default. So they play a very major role in situ conservation. So here we talk about what are the benefits which are linked with the in situ conservation strategies of the agrobiodiversity conservation. So conservation of both genetic material and the processes which are associated with the genetic material, they are conserved along with them. So what happens is the various crop plants, basically they have evolved uh, in the natural conditions. So their natural evolution process is basically not hampered in the in situ method of conservation. So processes which have caused the variation in the genetic material of the crop plants, they are also conserved. So basically the plants, they are conserved in the natural surroundings in where they have been evolved, sorry. The long term sustainability of the breeding efforts, it basically depend on the availability of the genetic variation that can be maintained and developed in the farmer field. So here we can maintain those genetic variations which have led to the various kinds of variation in your crop plants, that can be ensured in the crop farmers on the farmers field. Okay. uh, in situ conservation, at the same time, it helps in conservation of large number of varieties of various kinds of crop plants at a single site. Okay. So you can manage large number of agrobiodiversity, uh, and the flora and fauna which is associated with this the main crop plant, they are also conserved during the in situ process of conservation. So we might not be involving various kinds of other strategies for them. In one strategy only, we can address all the conservation needs of large number of species at a single site. Okay. So you can say it is it is pocket friendly approach. And at the same time, a large amount of germplasm, it is basically conserved during this scenario. Then we talk about the disadvantages which are linked with the uh, in situ methods of conservation of the agrobiodiversity. So here it is difficult for scientists to address and assess the genetic material being conserved. So large number of genetic material is being conserved, but it might be possible that some kind of genetic erosion can occur, or the genetic material might not be bred very pure. So purity of the genetic breed, it can be affected because of that, because large number of genetic material, it is there in the field of the farmer. So it is not possible for scientists to identify and access the genetic material at the same time. They are not able to segregate them. So XC2 approach is far more better in this case, where the scientists and the breeders, they have the tight access or tight control over the genetic material of the plant. Genetic erosion can still occur due to unforeseen circumstances such as war and natural disasters, which can occur, and because of that, the genetic erosion, it can occur. So these are various disadvantages which are linked with the in situ method of agrobiodiversity conservation. Next is the ex situ method of conservation of the agrobiodiversity, and that includes the cryopreservation, in which in the liquid nitrogen at ultra low temperature of minus 193 degrees centigrade, the plant genetic material, it is basically saved. Then we have the field gene banks, which include your seed banks and also for animals, the domesticated animals, we have the sperm banks, the egg banks, which are there, in which we can conserve the genes of these domesticated animals. Then we have the in vitro conservation, followed by the live plants in the botanical gardens. The botanical gardens are there, in which we can conserve the plants also. Now, here we will talk about what are the benefits which are associated with the conservation. Please give me a moment. So here we will talk about what are the benefits which are associated with the conservation of the plant the agrobiodiversity, and the ex situ methods of the conservation of the agrobiodiversity. Basically, here the plant genetic material is easy to identify, and the seed breeders, they have the tight control over the genetic material and the genetic lineage from where this genetic material is being derived. They have the strict control over that. That is basically the advantage of that. And here we can ensure that there is no mixing of the genes which occur here. So crossbreeding can be controlled in this scenario. The genetic diversity maintained by this method is directly controllable. As I have talked about, the likelihood of losing material is relatively low, and also access is also relatively straightforward. There is straightforward access towards the genetic material. These are basically the benefits which are linked with the ex situ methods of biodiversity conservation, agrobiodiversity conservation. Next, we will talk about the disadvantages. If we talk about the disadvantages, the ongoing evolutionary process is basically halted because of as we remove the genetic material from the field. So the evolutionary process is hampered. So in the natural surroundings where newer varieties, they are being getting evolved, that process is hampered in this scenario. It is also an expensive endeavor, because we have to conserve the agrobiodiversity in the controlled environment, and for that we need large kind of expenditure. Also, the cost scenario affect the choice of crops which are collected for ex situ conservation. The scientists and the plant breeders might not be interested in conserving those breeds which have very low use value, or they might not have any potential at the current scenario, but in future they might show some promising results. So at present they don't have much discovered uses, but in future they might have some good promises, they have some good benefits which will be derived from them. So it is possible that the plant breeders, they might not be so much keen for conserving such kind of plant resources. So these are the disadvantages which are linked with the ex situ conservation strategies. Then we come to the role of economic analysis in on-farm conservation. So here we have learned that on-farm conservation or in situ conservation is a better scenario, but there are some economic challenges and economic aspects which are linked with that. So basically, first one is the use value. So the use basically refer to the aesthetics, ecosystem support function, or the recognition that genetic resources are mutable stocks that are important for the future of mankind. So basically, these are some of the uses which are linked with your agrobiodiversity, and for these uses, the agrobiodiversity must be conserved. Some of the most genetic diverse plant populations of potentially great value to global society are basically grown by some of the poorest human populations in the world. This is very important, as we know that at current scenario, there are multinational organizations and multinational companies such as Monsanto and other organization. Basically, they are controlling the plant genetic material and resources, and only the few cultivars they are grown at present at large scale in the agro ecosystems. So if we talk about the poorest farmers or those farmers which have small land holdings, they are basically playing a major role in maintaining the genetic diversity of the plants. So they are preventing the genetic homogenization which are we are currently facing. At current stage, we are seeing that plant homogenization is basically occurring. We are growing the same variety of plant at a very large scale, and that's why they are very much susceptible to various kinds of diseases, and at the same time they require large investment in the form of the fertilizers and pesticides. But on the flip side, if we talk about the traditional agriculture, in the traditional agriculture, the small land holdings and poorest farmers, they are playing a major role in conservation of agrobiodiversity, uh, because they are using them for their future use. They are potentially saving them for their own benefit. That is why they play a major role in this conservation. Now, most small farmers produce food crops for their own consumption, as I've told you, and these traits often include not only agronomic characteristics such as tolerance to biotic and abiotic stress, but sometimes the farmers, they have to produce, the small farmers, they have to basically prepare some kind of small special dishes, and for them also they are conserving the agrobiodiversity or growing these crop plants which are having lesser value for the other world, but they are growing them for preparing the special dishes. So this is also one of the economic scenario. Next is India's agrobiodiversity wealth. Here we will talk about the agrobiodiversity which is found in India, and India is a center of origin of the rice, brinjal, banana, cucumber, citrus, and many kind of spice species of plants. Then a total number of 811 cultivated plants and 902 of their wild relatives, they can be found in India. And out of that, we have 700 species of fungi and also 100 species of bacteria that are discovered here. Also in India, if we talk about, there are many kinds of land races of rice, such as Konamani in Tamil Nadu, Agnibora in Assam, and Kerala we have Pokhali, which have promising genetic makeup. And then in wheat, if we talk about, then Bhalia wheat is there, which is acting as excellent cow feed, which is there from Gujarat. And in Himachal Pradesh, also there is a mushroom variety known as Gucci, which is used for food purpose. If we talk about buffalo, there are two breeds such as Murrah and Jafrabadi. They are coming from Haryana and Gujarat, and they have uh, they are producing milk at large scale. So these are some of the major features of the India's agrobiodiversity wealth. Then we have here we will talk about the domesticated animal diversity which can be found in India. In India, we can see 42 breeds of the cattle, 15 breeds of buffaloes, 34 breeds of goat, 43 of the sheep, and 19 breeds of the chicken. Here we will talk about the role played by women folk in the conservation of the agrobiodiversity, especially the tribal women. They play a major role in that. In India, we have the 53 million tribal people, especially concentrated in the central India, the northeastern region, and also in the your Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And here we can see the tribal women, they play a major role. There is a gender-based role in harvesting of the biodiversity or the agrobiodiversity, in which women play a very important role. They have developed various kinds of ecological skills and knowledge through which they sustainably harvest the agrobiodiversity. The classic example is Apatani tribes, which have gender-based ecological knowledge and skills. And in here, in this situation, in this tribe, especially the older women, they can identify varieties of paddy which are suited for various kinds of soil conditions, and they also select the pure seeds. So this is basically the Apatani tribe, and also there are many various tribes such as Baiga which are present in the central India, Gonds, Bhils. They have evolved n number of strategies for the management of biodiversity in the home gardens and also in the agricultural fields. Here we will talk about the concept of the ecological agriculture. So ecological agriculture basically includes your organic farming, in which your pesticides, chemical-based pesticides and chemical-based fertilizers, they are not used. Instead of that, farmyard manure or cow dung manure and your natural pest controllers, they are employed instead of using the chemical-based pesticides. Then we have ecological pest management. In this, there are various predators of insect pest which can be employed for the management of the insect pest. For example, I told you about the ladybird beetle, ladybug beetle. You can see them, especially in the month of April, March, April. They are the excellent predators of the aphids, so the plant lice. So these plant lice, they basically suck the plant juice, and they can affect our agricultural output. So ecological pest management basically employs the natural ways through which we can manage our insects and pests. Then promoting the native pollinators. At present in India, many honeybee breeders, they are importing various kinds of European bees, European bee species, they are imported here. But that is not the solution for the sustainable agriculture. Basically, we have to promote the native species of Apis. Apis is the generic name of the honeybee. So native pollinators must be focused upon in the ecological agricultural scenario. Then we have to talk about the multi-cropping. Multi-cropping must be employed in the ecological agriculture. Polyculture must be done. As we know that in monoculture, there is more susceptibility of the crop plants towards the insect pests. But in polyculture, the susceptibility, it is reduced, and also the fertility of the soil, it is enhanced or it is restored. Then we have to take care of the crop rotation pattern. The wheat rice crop rotation pattern must be discarded, and in that instead of that, we have to focus on other sustainable crop rotation patterns. certification of the organic products, and reducing post-harvest losses. It is also forming a part and parcel of ecological agriculture practices. Then here we can see on this slide the agrobiodiversity hotspots which are present in India. We have 22 agrobiodiversity hotspots which are present region wise, and here it is. You can see the list of all those agrobiodiversity hotspots. And in this slide, we can see the threat status of the livestock breeds. There are many kinds of livestock breeds, as we have discussed, and many of them, they are endangered. And for example, in cattle, we have the Mewati cattle breed, which is endangered at present. It has only 14,773 members, which are left. Then in buffalo, the Toda breed, it is endangered. Only 3,003 number of the organisms, they are present, still living of this breed. And similarly in sheep, we have the Karna, and in goat, we have the Attapadi black. These are vulnerable or endangered. Then we come to the action points for the conservation of agrobiodiversity in India, especially how we can conserve them. First, we can identify the various kinds of agrobiodiversity rich areas in India, and we can integrate them into globally important agrobiodiversity hotspots. Also, we can protect them, these agrobiodiversity hotspots, by implementing the agrobiodiversity index. We can manage them through the scenario on the agrobiodiversity index, and also in the 4 dimensions, that is diets, production, seed system, and conservation. Diets must be nutritious, which is derived from the agrobiodiversity. The production system must be sustainable. The seed systems must be so that traditional crop variety seeds, they are conserved. And then we have the conservation scenario. So on these parameters, agrobiodiversity hotspots, they can be managed. Then we have agrobiodiversity related business can be promoted in these hotspot areas that will create near farm jobs for the women and the youth especially, and that will also improve the job scenario. Then we have to also focus on the people's biodiversity register, and in this, the suitable varieties must be identified and documented in these agrobiodiversity rich areas. Along with that, we have to ensure the GI branding or the geographical indications tag for some of these varieties, so that better monetary returns can be ensured for the local communities. Then we have to see that state-wise mapping of on-farm conservation sites must be there, and agriculture universities must come forward for this purpose, and they can identify the suitable field sites where they can carry out the various kinds of nature walks for educating the students, and agro-tourism can also be promoted in this scenario. Then we have to provide the incentives to the small farmers and those with having very small land holdings, or the traditional farmers, so that the loss of agrobiodiversity can be checked. And finally, a national level database on agriculture important plant and animal species, and also insects, fungi, and microbial organisms, they can be developed. And also agroclimatic zone wise mapping of these resources must be ensured. So these are some of the ways through which we can, in India especially, these points can be used for the conservation of the agrobiodiversity. Finally, we come to the Beej Bachao Andolan. This is one of the very important Andolan which is started in Jardhari Gaon, located in Garhwal Himalayas in late 1980s. Here, Vijay Jardhari, he played an important role of conservation of the traditional varieties of the crop plants, mainly of cereals and beans, and also vegetables. So here, basically, this movement is started for by the small farmers, and it is basically focusing on bringing back the local traditional varieties of the crop plants and bringing back the traditional agriculture system through which these crop varieties, they are conserved. So there is a system which is followed, especially in the mountainous area, known as Bara Anaja, where 12 kinds of grains or cereal grains, they are uh, grown together in a multi-cropping system. You can say it is a polyculture, not monoculture. So basically, for reviving those kinds of traditions, Beej Bachao Andolan has been started. So basically, it is a non-violent a Gandhian protest, and through peaceful means this andolan is carried out, and it is against basically the weapon invasion or the market invasion by the industry and the market forces, in which they provide various kinds of GR packages and technologies to the farmers, so that and because of this, the traditional varieties now they are neglected. So this Andolan is basically focused on saving the traditional varieties. So here are some of the references, and with this, I come to the end of this session. Thank you so much.
Can you go back to your last but one slide with the references?
Sure.
Just a minute.